I don't know if I'm coming through or not, but that's okay. It's great to see you on a beautiful January morning. The view of the Smokies this morning was spectacular. I'm sure you all noticed that as you were coming in here. That's one thing about coming to Alcoa. You don't ever get tired of the view. It's a great view, and it reminds us of what God's doing all the time, creating and revealing to us the beauty of the earth and the beauty of all that He's able to do. Lent's not that far away. It's kind of interesting to me that Ash Wednesday is on Valentine's Day, and I think Easter is on April Fool's. Who says God doesn't have a sense of humor? But what I hope for us to do today is to share with you some materials, some preaching resources that will spark your imagination as you begin to live with your congregation through this season of Lent, and then into Holy Week, and then the celebration of the resurrection. Now, the way I see this going is Brian Davis, my colleague here, who's been working with me this year on preaching resources, is going to share with us, first off, some preaching possibilities that are not based on the lectionary. And then I have printed off for you from the Board of Discipleship and a resource that they have provided, and some of you may have seen it already. It's entitled Rehab. That goes through Lent and Easter, and we'll just talk about it a little bit, not a whole lot, because I wanted to put that in your hands. So if you have it already, then share it with a friend who doesn't have it already. But it's a pretty good resource, and it's very comprehensive. It's a whole lot more comprehensive than what Brian and I are going to do today, because they talk about hymns. They talk about where the hymns come from, what they mean, and I mean it's a very comprehensive look at preparing to preach for Lent and Easter. And then I've got some sermon ideas based on the lectionary, and we'll go over those. And then Brian has some other sermon possibilities of some other ways you might go, some things that he's used. But what I hope that this will be a dialogue among us, that it won't be just us just talking to you, but that if you think of something, if you think of an illustration as we're talking that said, well, I told this story one time, and it really fit right here. Well, everybody would benefit to hear that. Agreed? Everybody would benefit to hear that, because our greatest resource as preachers is other preachers. I don't know about you, but I like listening to other preachers, because it sparks my imagination into what God is calling me to say or inspiring me to say. So I hope this will be a time of dialogue back and forth, and where everybody feels like you have an opportunity to contribute, because that will enrich our time together, and I think we'll make it a good day. We'll go from now. We'll take a break in about an hour. We'll go to lunch. We're going to have Chick-fil-A, and then we'll come back and we'll go for a couple of more hours, and plan to be finished out the door on your way home at 3:00. So I'm looking forward to it. I appreciate y'all being here. I can't think of anything better that I enjoy more in my ministry than being with Methodist preachers. And one of the things I realize is that we don't get together enough. We really don't. Now, we have district preachers meetings, and a lot of people bellyache about that. spend 2 hours a month with your closest colleagues, and somehow that's too much. See, I don't get that. I just don't get that. So I think that our time together and the fellowship that we can share, because we don't all know each other, but we share a common ministry, and we're working to do the work of God in the Holston Conference, and that is vitally important. And the more we're connected, guess what? The stronger we'll be. The more we're connected, the stronger we'll be. You know, where we have problems among ourselves, you know what it is, don't you? When we become disconnected from one another. That's when trouble starts. Every single time. Every single time. Well, I'll stop preaching. Let's pray. Lord, we're thankful for this magnificent day. No one has ever lived this day before, but you have given it to us as a gift. And as we share this time together, as we prepare to proclaim the great good news that Jesus is alive this very day, we pray that your Holy Spirit would fill this room, that it would come into our hearts, and it would inspire us to do our very best to be proclaimers of all that you desire for your people to know. We ask these favors in Jesus' sake, for Jesus' sake and no other reason. Amen. All right, Brother Brian.
How's that? Better? All right. Well, I learned a valuable lesson this morning. Thanks to Susan, I got all these papers put together. I don't know if they're in the right order or not, so let's just hope they are. But apparently, and some of you all might know this, the copying machine will actually not only make copies, but it will put things in the proper order and staple them for you. I don't know how many of y'all knew that already, but I learned that this morning, that it would do all that after I printed everything. So there was no shortcut for me when it came to printing. And reality is, for preaching, there's really no shortcut either, right? You still have to do the work. And so even though we're here, we're getting a head start, but there's no shortcut to good preaching. Good preaching is what it is, and it's hard work. And it's a lot of study time, and it's prep time, it's prayer time, it's all of those things. So, but I'm glad to be here, and I hope that we can sort of just share some ideas together. The sermon series that I chose, I did it kind of selfishly because I got to do the topical one, and I've been thinking about a sermon series because I like the show Breaking Bad. I don't know how many of y'all watched the TV show Breaking Bad when it was on. I love that show. And I knew I couldn't really do a sermon series from the show itself probably, but I could use the title of the show for a sermon series. And so I came up with Breaking Bad Habits. And the focus was going to be on the 7 deadly sins, which I learned weren't really biblical. How many of y'all knew that? I did not. So I came into this full-blown, they're somewhere in the Bible. I just could never find them. And lo and behold, I realized that they were really a part of early church tradition, but they still have grounding in Scripture. And so I was going to use the 7 deadly sins, and I added one at the end for Easter called hopelessness, which isn't really one of the 7 deadly sins, but I had to do something to make it a complete sermon series. You'll notice, I believe there's, 10 sermons, and you all may not be preaching that many times in Lent. I don't know, because there's one for Maundy Thursday, there's one for Good Friday, one for Ash Wednesday, and so if you're going to do this series, you can do them in whatever way you want. You can cut some out, you can cut some off the beginning, or however you want to make that work. If you, like for instance, the second one is the heart of the matter, which would work for Ash Wednesday too, because it's Valentine's Day, right? So that might be something kind of cool. But so be flexible. I also want to do a sermon series that you could use at a time that wasn't Lent, because I also knew you were going to get a lectionary-based one, and you might like that better, or maybe find it more appropriate. But you don't want to waste the whole morning, and so you could take this and use it later on down the road also. So I tried to design one that wasn't, that didn't have to be done in Lent. So it won't hurt my feelings if you use it on down the road. So that's sort of my kind of summing up the series as a whole. So breaking bad habits, which is a study of the 7 deadly sins. I used 3 books, but I brought 2 of them for you just so you could see it. One is by Andy Stanley, called Enemies of the Heart. It's not really about the 7 deadly sins, but he uses a few of those in the Enemies of the Heart. So I got this because Recovery at Cokesbury was using that book like through November and December. So I had that and found it useful. And then Will Willimon has a book called Sinning Like a Christian. I mean, you got to love the title of that book, Sinning Like a Christian. And so he looks at each one of the 7 deadly sins. So if you wanted to, you could pick those up. There's several books out there. You can go to Amazon and just Google some books and just kind of go through them. But those were the ones I chose to use. So any questions or thoughts before we go to Ash Wednesday about the series as a whole? Or all right, how many of y'all have ever preached a sermon series on the 7 deadly sins? Well, me either. So this is all right. Well, if you turn in your paper, let's look at Ash Wednesday. And what I tried to do for each one is kind of give an opening and then a scripture and then a few points that you can use. Now, here's the thing. I just firmly believe that you can't preach somebody else's sermon. Like, you just can't do it. And so I was trying my best to not, like, give you a sermon that you would just have to preach verbatim, because I realize, one, your illustrations may be different than mine. I didn't use a lot of personal illustrations, so that you might want to put some of those in if you like to do that. Some of the points that I use, I derive those from the books I was reading and some of my own kind of experience, but you may find that you have a point that's much better. You may do some reading and studying and decide, you know what, I like this point better, and that's okay. Go for it. You may also find that you like a scripture better than the one I've chosen, and that's okay too. I just believe that this is a place to jump off, right? This is a place to get our creative minds flowing. For me, sometimes when I'm stuck preaching, I'll just go read somebody's sermon. I don't even use any of the sermon, but it gets my mind, working. And then I've come up with something completely different. But it was because of the other stuff that got me thinking. And so that's what I hope this will do. Not that you're just going to go and preach verbatim what's on the sheet of paper. Because, again, if it's not your sermon, it's not going to be impactful. And it's not going to be you. And people in your congregation will know that, right? Because they know you. So that's my preface. Now, are you ready? All right. Ash Wednesday. How many of y'all have an Ash Wednesday service? So almost every one of you. I don't know about you. I always feel like I'm at my worst preaching on days like Ash Wednesday, Maundy, Thursday, Good Friday, Easter, and Christmas Eve. I don't know if you all feel that way. Sometimes I feel that way. So hopefully this will kind of help us get thinking about those days anyway. So the title that I titled it, Sinning Like a Christian, because I was using that book, and I just thought it was a great title. I just love that title. And my opening thought was really because in the churches that I've served, and this may not be the case for you, but in the churches that I've served, it's been important for me to explain what in the world is Ash Wednesday. Because in the churches I've served, this is new for a large percentage of the folks there. So, again, that might not be the case for you all, but it has been the case for me. And it's also been the case for me. I've kind of had to explain Lent just a little bit. And if I were preaching this sermon, I'd probably start off with something personal. Like I was going to tell the story of my son, my youngest son. We were sitting around the table eating. We were talking about what we were giving up for Lent. And last year, I gave up meat for Lent. And so we were talking about that. And my son, Micah, he can't stand soup. He hates soup of any kind. And so anytime we have soup, he begs for grilled cheese. So we all went around the table, and we got to Micah, who's 5 years old. And I said, Micah, what are you going to give up for Lent? And he said, I'm giving up soup for Lent. And which is, it's pretty smart on his part. Just so you know, he also gave up soup for Easter, soup for the summer, soup for the fall, soup for Halloween. He's given up soup year-round now. So that's just sort of his thing for Jesus, I guess, is to give up soup. But, sometimes we kind of come into Lent with some wrong ideas about what it means to give something up. And I'm guilty myself sometimes. I like to lose weight during Lent, but that's not really about a spiritual discipline as much as it is about me looking better, right? Now, it's good to lose weight for a particular reason besides looking good. So I think it's always good to talk about what in the world is Ash Wednesday, what in the world is Lent, what are we doing when we choose to take on a spiritual discipline, and all of those things. And in this sermon, I was focusing more on sin, right? In the passage in Mark chapter 1, 14 and 15 about repenting and believing, and I know that kind of ties in with Ash Wednesday. And so I kind of took the idea of repenting and believing, but why does this matter? Why is this a big deal? And why is it so hard, right? Why do we have to do this every year? Why is it hard to do that? And so I think part of the problem is in our culture, we really value self-esteem, which is a good thing. I think that's a very good thing. But it also means that we take the light sometimes off the places in our lives where we need to change and grow. And it takes the focus off sin and things like that in our lives. And so our culture has shifted away from looking at the sin in our lives and focused more on the positive aspects of our life, which again, I think is a really, really good thing, but it's an incomplete picture. So in order to talk about repenting and believing, we also have to deal with sin in our life. And so that was my number one point. And number two, I'm not preaching at a church right now, so I could put this kind of stuff down. So just so you know, in the church, we prefer to examine the sins of those outside the church, while we fail to acknowledge the sins inside the church. I don't know if you all do that at your churches or not, but it is really easy, right, to look at us and say, we're better than those folks outside. And so we have this idea that when we walk in the church, sometimes we're made holy by entering the door, or what really happens is we're just covering up and playing the part of that. But we got to acknowledge that as people who are Christians. So that was my number 2 point. And number 3, it's easy to judge the sin of other people and never take account of our own sinfulness, and that happens even inside the church. We become judgmental instead of becoming people who are transformed. So for me, that's where Ash Wednesday is important, and so that's kind of where I started. So, all right, I'll stop there. So I'm talking really fast, so slow down just a second, let you process that. What are some of your thoughts? I mean, maybe you have some different, if you were just thinking about that off the top of your head, would you go a different direction or throw a different point in, or so? Yeah.
I know that you, I used to watch you on, when you were at First Seminary on the
Mhm.
or not using a manuscript. What do you think is the key to doing that?
Oh, okay. Um,
To getting to that point where
right.
you're reading criminal cases?
Sure. That's a great question, and I'm working with a pastor, and we've been working on this very thing. Um, what I suggested to him was to memorize illustrations first. Instead of trying to memorize all the content of the sermon that he's really nervous about, memorize the easy things, especially his own stories. So if you have a story about yourself, start by memorizing those stories first, and then working that way. So that's what I would say. Start with the easy stuff. Some people are just better at it than other people. I mean, I'm not very good at reading. So some people read a manuscript and it's just a beautiful thing. I can't do that. And so some of it, I think, is the way we're wired, too. I think some people have good memories and some people are great natural readers. And I think you have to go with your strength sometimes as well.
It's kind of funny because I was thinking about this. I'll spend the first part of the week writing my sermon in my head, and so I'm thinking about it all the time. And then once I'm done with it, I'm not thinking about it anymore.
Mm-hmm.
And then by the time the weekend is gone by, which is Friday and Saturday, and I've played with the kids and one of the other things, I've forgotten by Sunday morning. I've basically forgotten what I
Right.
wrote for my sermon. And then I read over it Sunday morning, and then I change a lot of it. So
Right.
I don't know.
Yeah, I think.
In that same situation.
Yeah, I do that too, and I get up at, what I do typically is I get up at 5 a.m. and I work on rememorizing the sermon that I had written is what I would do. And then when I would go up there, I'd only take an outline. I never took a manuscript, but again, that's just me. That's just how I did it. So I'd have, with what I just said, I'd have those 3 points in my illustrations, and that would be the only thing I would take. And I would only refer to it if I were stuck, which happens every now and then. The older I was getting, the more that would happen. So, but yeah. Any other thoughts about the
Just an Ash Wednesday thought, because it's a weird service to preach.
Yes.
In a lot of ways, because it's kind of admitting that things aren't working out,
Yeah.
and publicly admitting that in some ways. And your point about self-esteem, I think, is it brings to mind actually what actually happens at Ash Wednesday too, the actual putting on the ashes and then going out in the public.
Mm-hmm.
Kind of like, it's in some ways I almost think we ought to mark like loser on the forehead. Because it really it's
Right.
like, here we are, these folks who are admitting vulnerability, brokenness, our stock deals didn't work out, whatever it is. But it's also the other point I'd add to that. It's almost a strange habit for the world around us. I can remember doing Ash Wednesday services in Chattanooga and then going to teach at a Baptist college at Tennessee Temple with the ashes on there and having the kids for a whole hour just watch my head.
Right.
And one girl afterwards saying, "Your head's dirty. Did you know that? You're in class with a dirty head." And because that was so foreign to me, but in some ways to our churches, it's foreign to be to say I'm vulnerable, I'm broken. God, this goes against the way we so often in our culture have God as a God of name it, claim it, faith and prosperity and all that. This is the dirty part of gospel in some ways. And I think if you leave people on edge with Ash Wednesday service, they're going to feel uncomfortable going out. I don't think it's not something where you're shouting hallelujah.
Right. Did everybody hear what Mike was saying? I think that's a great point. It is a very countercultural service, that we do. And really, most of the time when we leave churches, we want to leave feeling good. And there are some services that it's okay to leave in silence or leave feeling, human. So, yeah.
Barriers to our repenting and believing, and I think one of those might be just not recognizing sin as sin,
Yes.
justifying it.
Mm-hmm.
So if we lie, there was a good reason to,
Right.
or it helps someone,
Yes.
or it's somebody else's fault. So it's just a certain barrier to repenting and believing is no longer calling sin sin.
Yeah, I think that's true, and especially when we do call a sin, it's for somebody that's not us, right? Somebody else. We're okay saying that's a sin. We have a harder time. We lie to ourselves because we justify it. So it's harder to say my sin is a sin. And, mm-hmm. Yes. It does. It does. Yeah. Very good.
Just a thought there on Wesley talking about after justification, sin remains, but it doesn't reign. And I think that can be very beneficial to somebody who's in a process toward perfection to realize that we are going to falter.
Mm-hmm.
That faltering can't reign in our lives, that we have to figure out how to break it.
Right. Right.
But I think sometimes acknowledging that we're all sinners, that we all fall short.
Mm-hmm.
And that we don't give each other a pass on that, but that is part of it. I thought about a spiritual audit. Your books may look good, but how did you get there?
Right.
Was everything in order to get to that place?
Mm-hmm.
Talk about self-esteem and looking good. What's the process of the journey to do
Mm-hmm. Yes, absolutely. Yeah, that's good. Good stuff. All right, one more. Yeah.
I think that in boldness this year, it might be an opportunity to have Ash Wednesday service before school starts and people go to work. That they can wear the badge of the ashes all day long. And with it being Valentine's Day and in conflict with the secular happening, that
Oh, yeah.
if you know your community
Mm-hmm.
well enough, that you can have Ash Wednesday Sunday, Ash Wednesday service at the break of day.
Yeah, I like that.
And talk about coming from the darkness of night with our sins.
Right.
Our, all that we have to face.
Mm-hmm.
And start off the day that way.
I like that idea. Yeah, that's great. It's a great idea. I like it. And because I know a lot of people, and I have been like this in my past too. You know, when you get something for Valentine's Day, you want to show everybody, somebody loves you and cares for you. But what better way to show by wearing a sign of a cross on our forehead? I like it. All right, I did provide on the next couple, I guess, front and back, just some sermon illustrations. This is really just for you. You don't have to use any of them if you don't want to. There's some quotes on there, and one of the things I did, being a part of recovery service now for the last couple of years, one of the things that strikes me as different from a recovery service and what you have on a Sunday morning is in a recovery service, everybody knows that everybody else there is recovering from something, right? Or they wouldn't be there. In church, it's almost like we hide everything that we're in recovery from so that nobody can see it, and it creates a very different atmosphere. And so if there was a way we could ever, like in an Ash Wednesday service or any service on Sunday, get to the point where we're okay saying, look, we're all recovering from something, all of us are. I mean, I know we as preachers, we wish that would happen. I don't know how you do that on a Sunday. If I knew, I'd write a book and be really... go around speaking about it. But I don't know, so I'm not doing that. And you wouldn't want to read a book I wrote anyway. So, all right, let's see. Any more thoughts on Ash Wednesday? And we'll go to the next one. All right, Lent number 1. I had Breaking Bad Habits. It's more of an introduction. The heart of the matter, and I actually used this Don Henley song later on. I was going to use it for this one and realized it was more about forgiveness, and so I moved it on down. But I like the title anyway, so I went with the heart of the matter. And I used a little opening illustration from the show Breaking Bad about Walter White and his kind of coming into selling meth. And just so if you've never seen the show, he was a science teacher, and he got lung cancer, and he wanted to figure out a way to provide for his family, and teaching wasn't going to do it, and so he knew how to make meth, and so he made meth and sold it. And so really this illustration is just about how by him continuing in this lifestyle, it began to change his character for the worse. If you watch the whole, all the seasons, you see a very different Walt from the beginning to the end, and how this repetitive behavior ended up changing him and causing him to become somebody that at the beginning he would have probably thought he would never wanted to be. But it's really about how our bad habits really will do the very same thing. These habits of the heart that sometimes we don't think much about, if we don't address those and we continue in those, they really create in us something that we don't want. And I was going to use Matthew 15. This is the passage where, one of the passages in which they asked Jesus why his disciples don't follow the fasting kind of code, and Jesus is really quick to say, look, it's not about what goes from the outside to the inside, but from what the inside coming out that makes you unclean. And then he goes on and says, all these things come from our hearts. So, and we know that he didn't really mean like the thing that beats necessarily, but it's really coming from the essence of who we are, right? It's the depth of who we are. Out of that comes our behavior. So if we want to change our behavior, we got to begin to address these issues that are in our hearts. And so number one point is to break bad habits, we have to begin with our heart. Our hearts carry the core of who we are, and they determine our actions. Later on, I have this great, it's kind of an illustration, and I was going to use it. If I did this sermon, I'd use it with one of my kids because they like to go sledding. And the little snow we had last, 2 weeks ago? Well, it wasn't like a huge snow, but it was just enough that you could sled. But the problem is you had to go down at one time, right, in order to get the kind of icy enough so that the sled would go down the hill. Well, once you made that one path, you could get back on that groove, and you could just sled all day. If you got onto a different place, you had to start a whole new groove, right? A whole new sledding place. By the way, my son went out in front of a car. Thank goodness he didn't. His dad was trying to start a new groove and couldn't get down there.
That's actually how the brain functions. My wife
Yes.
is a school psychologist, and she will tell you that if you want to break a habit, you need to do something in your brain actually trains you that way. It makes that kind of a groove in your brain to do something that way. And it takes about 6 weeks to make that habit something that you will do without having to think about it.
Yes. Thank you, Steve. And that's exactly where I was going, is that this is a real deal, right? Have you ever been driving home and you get home and you're like, how in the world did I get home? Well, because your brain's on autopilot. It's done that drive so many times, it naturally goes. That's why, when you're trying to go one place and you go somewhere else because your brain doesn't, recognize you're going to a different. Most of what we do, we're on autopilot. We have trained ourselves with these grooves. And if we have these bad habits, we've trained ourselves in those bad habits. And so, to Steve's point, we have to begin to learn new habits so that we can then again train our actions to follow suit. So, very good. Number two, I was going to use a definition from a book called Glittering Vices, which was a book that I used. She defines sin. She says, sin is the human condition, patterns of sinful behavior, or one single act of disobedience. We call all of those things sin, right? But then she said, a vice is a deeply rooted pattern in our character or heart. These patterns are broader than just a single act, but narrower than our human condition. Does that make sense? So a vice is what we would probably call a habit. And it's something that we continually do over and over again. And if you look at sort of the early church fathers and they're talking about the deadly sins, they're really deadly vices is really the better way, or capital vices is what they probably should be called. And number three, habits of the heart form from repeating behaviors over and over until they become so ingrained in who we are that we naturally follow this pattern of behavior. And number four, every bad habit or vice is really pursuing something good the wrong way. And I think this is a really important point. think about, and all the things that we're going to talk about with the deadly sins or all these habits, it's really trying to pursue something that's good. We're just doing it in the wrong way, and I think that's really important to point out. So it's trying to find our happiness outside of God, and so that was kind of how I would have closed the sermon. So anyway, and there's some sermon illustrations for you if you would like them, but I'll just stop there and ask you your thoughts. Yeah.
Hey, I love it all. Quick question, because we chose Breaking Bad, it's jumping off point.
Mm-hmm.
Obviously a show with meth use. So you deal with that. I mean, for example, I like Game of Thrones, I'll watch it, I enjoy it, and then I think theologically about it, but yet I'm fearful to talk about the kings
Mm-hmm.
of the Bible, like Game of Kings.
Right.
I hesitate because I think all they're going to hear is there's sex in the show.
Right.
They're going to be somewhere else.
Yeah.
So I guess my question, if you're going to use Breaking Bad or another show in culture, do you own it? Do you remove yourself from it but keep the themes of it? How do you approach it?
Right. Well, in this sermon series, I was only using that. I didn't use Breaking Bad again, partly because I couldn't think of a lot of great things from the show. That was really the primary reason. I think you have to know your congregation too, and I think, the two congregations I've served, one was more of a college age, young adult age group, and you can get away with more in that group. So I think you have to kind of know your audience, one, and know what they can handle. There are some that I was going to do that I didn't do for that very reason. Like I was going to do like 5 Shades of Grace, in that movie, and I talked myself out of it for that very reason, because I got right down to it. I mean, it was like the week of, and I was like, you know what? I'm afraid this is going to cause more turmoil than, the creativeness of using it. And so I pulled it at the last minute. So, but I would own it. And I've said things like, I'm not telling you to go watch this show, but at the same time, I think it's important to use things that connect with who you're trying to reach also and make them want to come back. I mean, saying we're going to preach on the 7 deadly sins versus breaking bad habits, there's a big difference. And if you're trying to draw people in, whenever we would do something on prayer, when I was at First Centenary, it never flew, because anytime you said the word prayer, everybody was like, I'm not going to go learn how to pray, about prayer. But if you could couch it in a kind of a cool way, people would come. So that's kind of where but you got to know your group. I mean, they may hate it. They may be like, do not ever talk about that show in our. So. And probably you could get away with breaking bad habits if you just don't use that opening illustration about the show. So, yeah. Anybody else? Any other thoughts about the habit, the heart deal, the heart of the matter? Some, maybe you thought of a point that I missed, or. I think N.T. Wright, doesn't N.T. Wright have a book about After You Believe? I think that's the name of the book, After You Believe, that he goes into this thing that Steve was talking about with your brain and habits. I believe that's the book that he does that in. So, good? Y'all ready to move on? All right.
I like that line in there about you are what you tweet. I'm thinking that's
Yes, you are what you tweet. All right. All right, Lent number 2. All right, I started, you're going to think this is funny, sort of, maybe. I started with the least of the 7 deadly sins and worked to the greatest, right? So that's the way I did it. Some people do it the opposite way, where they would have started with pride and worked, because generally now not early theologians, but generally, from Aquinas on, pride has been said as the worst of all the deadly sins, and things like lust is the least of the deadly sins, which is kind of funny in our culture because we don't really view it that way in our culture. Our culture views lust probably of all the deadly sins, at least one of the worst. And our culture is very fascinated with any kind of sexual sin. So our culture, that's like the worst thing ever. It's funny that the, early church theologians did not view it that way. As a matter of fact, C.S. Lewis, I didn't quote this on the paper, but C.S. Lewis in Mere Christianity has this great thought that he says about somebody who's prideful. He said it would be better for them to be a prostitute than to be prideful, although it's best to be neither. That's sort of C.S. Lewis's quote. So anyway, so there you go. So pride's not as bad. Lust isn't as bad as pride, but it's still a bad habit of the heart. And so I chose to start with lust. And then I started with the science of sin, because even lust today is seen in our culture as a positive thing. And so research shows that people who have sex on the brain are better at solving analytical problems, and and so we do live in a sex-crazed culture. I don't know about you all. How many of y'all eat at Hardee's? Have you ever seen one of those women that's on the commercial at Hardee's eating one of those hamburgers before? Has anybody ever? I've never seen any of those models at Hardee's when I go to eat hamburgers, and I'm amazed at blue jean commercials, because I watch the blue jean commercials and I'm like, they didn't even show blue jeans in the commercial. Like, they had women in the commercial, but I'm not sure they were wearing blue jeans. So that's just the way our culture is, and they know how to advertise those things, and we definitely live in a sex-crazed culture for sure. However, and I think this is an important point, the church's teaching on sexuality hasn't really helped either. So you got culture that's saying, do whatever feels good, and you have the church saying it's all bad. And that doesn't help matters at all. And so I think that part of the responsibility of the church is to teach a good balance about sexuality. That's just me. Maybe you have a different opinion about that, but I know, I was a youth director for a long time, and I know dealing with a lot of people, the church's teaching on sex and how bad and awful and dirty it is has been just as bad as society's teaching that you do whatever feels good. So I think in the church we have a long way to go when it comes to that. And so I use Jesus' teaching on lust when he compares it to adultery. The word actually, number one, means strong desire for. And so if we have a strong desire for somebody in our hearts, Jesus is basically saying we've committed adultery with that person. And I thought about this point, what we imagine because I was thinking maybe Jesus is being a little hard on us. But think about this, what we imagine in our brains, right, the desires that we have and the imagination that we have, they don't always actually stay in our minds, do they? Because if we imagine those things enough, there's in certain ways in which those things begin to come to life. I don't know if you've had an experience like that. I've had experiences like that. And so then I started thinking, well, maybe Jesus is on to something. If we continually think about these things in our brains and desire somebody, we will begin to act those desires out. And so perhaps what Jesus is saying is this is the foundation for adultery. And that's a big deal. And that's something that we've got to take to heart. To really understand what Jesus is getting at, we have to understand lust as opposed to the intention of sex. Sex was intended to connect us with somebody and to create life. Lust really wants us to have the benefits of sex without a relationship. And so thus it brings brokenness and death. Really, lust is a shortcut, right? Also would say this, we always view lust as pornography, and we equate those two things. what I've really realized is that lust is really, even in a marital relationship, is when a person, even in a marriage, uses sex selfishly. That is still lust. And so anytime, even in a marriage relationship, if somebody is using it in a way that doesn't bring life and doesn't connect them with the other person and with God, then that's just as bad as somebody viewing pornography or whatever else. And so sometimes I think we think, well, if we're married, we can do whatever we want when it comes to sex, and that's just simply not the case either. And then number 4, lust, like breaking any bad habit, is not always about succeeding. Ultimately, overcoming the bad habit of lust is a lifelong battle that we have to be intentional in. The key is to invest in connecting to God and to the people God has put into our life. And so, really, love is kind of the opposite in some ways of lust. And some of the interesting things about early church theologians is they actually believe that sometimes the reason why these habits like lust don't go away is because it keeps us from being prideful. So that's just a thought. I'll just throw that out there. You can do whatever you want with that. But, some of the anger, some of those, the lower level sins keep us from being prideful that we're better than everybody else. So, anyway. You don't have to preach that, by the way. You don't have to say that to your congregation. And then there's some possible illustrations. I use Body is a Wonderland by John Mayer to talk about our culture's obsession with sex. I actually really like that song. I don't know if I'd have your band play it before, but maybe you'd want to. I don't know. All right, any comments or?
I was just thinking as you were talking, it has a lot to do with contentment.
Mm-hmm.
That we're not happy with what God has allowed us to enjoy. We're not happy with what God has designed with us. And when we're married,
Mm-hmm.
that whole concept of God has given me my life, and I'm not content with that. I'm not sure God is.
Mm-hmm.
My question was authority in marriage.
Right.
Those kind of things came to my mind.
Sure. I mean,
Mm-hmm.
I think that's I think those are valid things to kind of, especially if you have a lot of married folks in your congregation. One of the things I didn't think about, and as I was going here, it kind of crossed my mind, is what a poor job we as a church do to talk to single people about lust and sexuality. I mean, we fail big time, I believe, in that area, because we basically just say, nope, you get married, we'll talk. Till you get married, don't express it in any way, shape, form, or fashion. So, yeah. And I don't have the answers, but I'm just saying we mess up. We mess up when we deal with that, with people. And, that's a big, we always think single people like, high school, college age, but think about, with people who are getting divorced, the amount of people who are single in their 40s and 50s, who are in our congregations. How do we talk to those folks about sexuality and lust? I mean, we can't just say, well, turn it to the person you're married to, because they don't have anybody that they're married to. So how do we deal with that? Because that's important. So.
Sometimes you don't have to fix it, you just need to acknowledge it in some cases. And people just think, hey, the church is thinking
Mm-hmm.
about this and that else. But it's the silence, I think, that
Mm-hmm.
most people feel like they're not even, they're not part of what's going on.
Right, exactly. I read a thing about how young people are turning to go to wine tasting things on Sunday morning because they get better fellowship and people understand them better at wine tasting than they do at church for that very reason. Scott?
I was just going to say about patterns. I wonder if there's an alternative, a pattern that's based from this. What's an alternative pattern for folks who deal with lust?
Mm-hmm.
So, it's interesting. Jesus is really saying that sin begins in your mind.
Mm-hmm.
What patterns can you create to pathways that you can help find
Mm-hmm.
more freedom in their life?
Yeah, I think it's a good, and that would be, in fleshing out the sermon, what are those patterns? And some of you can maybe think of some great ideas about, I know C.S. Lewis, when he talks about chastity, kind of around this topic. C.S. Lewis's thing is, he's dealing with, even though he's single, he's talking to married people, and he said, part of the issue is, there's two kinds of love. There's this feeling kind of love, and then there's this commitment sort of love. And after a while, you move into this commitment, and the feeling part's not there so much, so then you think you're not in love anymore. That's one of the ways C.S. Lewis says, suck it up, is really what he says. So, but yeah, I think that's good. I think trying to deal with how to do that.
Did C.S. Lewis say feel differently about that after he got married?
He didn't really write about it after he got married. He probably threw all those books of stuff away that he wrote on that. It was funny. He was talking about what kind of authority figure he was to talk to married people, even though he wasn't married. So, and by the way, C.S. Lewis has some affair type things in his past, like some of those things in his past too. So he's not squeaky clean either. So just so you know, sometimes just because you say the right thing doesn't mean you don't struggle to do the right thing. So. All right, any more thoughts? Y'all let's get away from lust to something easier. So we'll go to gluttony. How's that?
Don't go to meddling.
How about we do gluttony and we'll take a break? So we'll do gluttony and then you can go find some food somewhere. I've used this before. It's under the sermon illustration part about gluttony. That Wendy's commercial when I was younger anyway, where's the beef? I've used that before in a sermon, where they look at the big bun, they're like, where's the beef? I feel like that's sort of our obsession with food. We want bigger hamburgers and all that. Well, the opening I put on here was the USDA and just some statistics about how much time we spend eating, 28,000 hours eating. So that's pretty crazy. But not only that, but think about how we arrange our lives around our food. Have you ever fasted and realized that you plan your whole day based on when you're going to eat and where you're going to eat? Like I get up for breakfast and I'm thinking about where I'm eating dinner. That's just how I roll. Our whole lives are geared. And if I'm on a diet, I spend my whole day planning my diet. And, that food is that, controlling in our lives. The scripture I picked was kind of unique. It's the 1 Corinthians passage. By the way, this is the first Sunday in March, and so I thought it would tied pretty well. For a lot of people do communion the first Sunday of the month. So, and that 1 Corinthians passage is kind of a typical communion text. Although, if you read about that passage, it's not necessarily about communion. I think we've built this fear in people that because of this passage, if you take communion in an unworthy manner, that you're going to die. I don't know. I've had people quote that to me. Well, you shouldn't let kids take communion because if they do it in an unworthy manner, they might die. I'm like, are you serious? But they've been taught this. But really, the problem in this 1 Corinthians text is the fact that they all shared a meal in the early church together when they were in homes, right? So they would show up and have these dinners and then some teaching and then maybe the Lord's Supper. Well, what was happening is that the wealthy people were getting there ahead of time and bringing all the food and eating all the food, and the poorer people were showing up and not having any food. So basically, Paul's like, if you're hungry, eat at home, so that you can share the food that you have. And then he says, the way that you take communion in that manner is the way that you should eat together. And so he uses communion as a way to give instructions for how they all ought to eat together. And so I use that as a jumping off place, and to say that part of gluttony is overeating. Our bodies require food for nutrients, so we were created to enjoy food so that we would eat and stay alive. Gluttony is simply eating far more than what our body needs to survive, thus causing us to be unhealthy. That's kind of a fact, right? That's just the way it is. I was reading a book, it's called Why Buddhism is True, and he basically started and he's talking about natural selection and how we are where we are, that our body has certain desires, and one of those is eating. We wouldn't pass on anything to anybody if we didn't eat. But because of that, we always get hungry, right? Because if you had one meal and it satisfied you forever, we would all die because we would never go back and eat. And so our body tricks us by telling us to eat. And the problem is when we continue to feed it too much, it begins to crave more and more. And then we become unhealthy. Plus the processed stuff they put in food, like the salt, all that stuff is geared to make you eat more. That's why you can't eat just one potato chip. I mean, because that salt makes you crave, and the stuff they put in potato chips makes you crave more potato chips. Same thing with sugar, and our body's going to crave that. And so that's why you can't just go have one M&M. Your body's like, I got to have 2, 3, and then you eat a whole bag. Anyway, that's enough about me. Number 2, gluttony is far more than just what we are eating. It is the obsession with food itself. We can be skinny, carb and calorie counters, and be just as obsessed with food as those who overeat. It's the obsession that is the bad habit. I remember I was trying to lose weight last year, and I was logging all my stuff in MyFitnessPal, and so I was eating with a whole table full of people. And they're all having this great conversation, and I'm in there on my phone trying to put in all the calories that I was eating. And I realized I missed the golden opportunity to interact and do what you're supposed to do around the table fellowshipping by trying to be healthy, right? And so it's the same principle. Sometimes the overeating is a big deal, but sometimes just our focus on food is a big deal. And then number 3 is gluttony represents our compulsive behavior. We indulge to meet a need, but then we realize it doesn't actually get met with food. When we have the discipline to not give in to food compulsions, it teaches us how to not give in to other compulsions and to find our needs met in the love of God. And here's what I've really realized. That this is true. When you fast, one of the great things in the discipline of fasting is it teaches us not just to give in to our food cravings, but when we're confronted with other compulsive behaviors in our life, it teaches us to have the discipline to deal with those other things in our life. So that's kind of where my jumping into maybe communion and having God satisfy those needs. And, you get just a little amount of food at communion, right? Just a small piece of bread and a sip of juice. Some churches, they give you those big hunks of bread, but it's certainly not enough to fill you up. But the point is it's a reliance on God's grace. And so anyway, that's where I went. I read this story. This is just funny. If you read on down about a dog named Wilson that gobbled up 7 golf balls. That's kind of a funny story. I've used that before. So anyway, so that's a little bit about where's the beef, about gluttony. Any thoughts about gluttony? I don't think this is going to win you any points. But if I were doing, kind of starting a new groove, I would encourage fasting is probably what I would do. I think fasting would be a great spiritual discipline to help balance and start a new groove in our behavior, in our compulsive behaviors, in our food addictions. So,
I don't know if this would tie in, but one thing I've noticed is some people who've been going through chemotherapy or some things get to where they don't want to eat. Everything tastes bad to them. It tastes metallic or whatever. And they talked about sort of the opposite, that it's really hard to eat when it doesn't taste good.
Yeah. Yeah.
Most of us say, oh, the problem with eating is the other.
Right.
But it's, if you don't have that,
Yeah.
and I don't know if that ties in.
I think so. I think one of the illustrations I think I gave you was one from C.S. Lewis, and he's talking about a lady who was so nitpicky when she's eating, and she used that to control other people, but how he saw that as gluttony and very sinful. But again, I think it's our obsession with food. My father-in-law has this allergy that makes him have reflux. And it's not really that bad, but his diet is so restrictive that nobody can cook for him anymore. And so all he does is gripe and complain anytime somebody gives him food because of, And so I feel like he's done the opposite. He's obsessed about food, but it's not in an overeating way. He's obsessed because it's a controlling mechanism for him. So, not that I would use that because my father-in-law would probably get back to him somehow.
You all may have heard, Sam Urban, he was the senator from North Carolina. During Watergate, he made a comment one time. He said, God might have made something that tastes better than country ham, but if he has, I'm not eating it. I'd have to say amen.
Yeah. I need this sermon right before Thanksgiving because I got to wear sweatpants to dinner so that I can, comfortably let my belly expand after the meal's over. So, all right. Yeah.
There's an article on Lent by a United Methodist preacher in Alabama, and one of the things she did was give some alternatives to that. Well, if it's compulsive behavior, let's give up electronic nights. Have an electronic-free day. No email, no tweets, no presidential tweets. All these other things that you want to give up.
I love it.
But that was one of her suggestions was an electronic fast.
I love it. I think that's great because really, again, about fasting, it's not just the food; it's all of these things that we're compulsive in. I mean, I should probably give up. The bishop told me I should give up social media because it's a compulsive thing for me sometimes. I don't know about you, but I got to check it all the time. Twitter. I got to know what's on Twitter. I got to know if Mike's been on Facebook today, and that's as bad as overeating, right? I mean, that's a huge thing, having to know what's on your phone all the time. I was just a small story, but I was in my counseling appointment one time, and I had my phone sitting right here, and somebody texted me, and I didn't even I didn't know who it was, but the counselor stopped me, and he said, "I can tell something changed in your eyes." He was like, as soon as you heard that ding, you don't even know who it is, but your eyes changed because all your brain now was thinking, I want to know who the message is from, right? It's the same deal as food. I mean, I think that's gluttony, and mm-hmm.
That's pretty important.
Yeah. Yeah. Good. All right. Are y'all ready for a little break? All right. Go find some gluttonous things to partake in, and we'll come right back. How about 10 minutes? 10 minutes.